Some have discussed Joe Burrow and injury prone in the same sentence. Let's break down why that may or may not be true for the Bengals quarterback.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco. He's your host, James Rapine. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere you get your podcasts. Today, we're going to be discussing the injury-prone label that has been applied rightly or wrongly to Joe Burrow. We'll break down why there's some grains of truth in the injury-prone label and why maybe it's been overblown by some. Also, what's different in the practices starting next week for the Cincinnati Bengals as they get into the OTA part of the offseason? What does an OTA even mean? Well, we'll let you know a little bit later on in the show. But first, James, you were on a show earlier this week where someone asked you, is Joe Burrow injury prone? And of course, you can look at the history, and we will look at the history, but it bears a conversation at some point that we've talked about obliquely over the years, I think, but not really in a dedicated, in-depth conversation.
And I think the answer is no. Joe Burrow isn't injury prone as of today. We're talking about a freak wrist injury that has never happened ever to a quarterback that Joe could find. And he has a lot of money and resources and the ability to find quarterbacks that have dealt with it, if so. And it just freak thing. And then an ACL where, let's be honest, his rookie year, everybody was on pins and needles with the hits he was taking because of that offensive line. And so I'm not saying it was bound to happen, but we can see the why. And so is there a scenario where Joe Burrow ends up becoming injury prone? Sure. But I don't think we're there yet. And so as of today, I would say no. A year from now, it may be different. It may feel different. But when you look at these injuries and the why, well, the wrist injury is just a freak thing that I don't think anyone could have anticipated or explained. And then the ACL, well, those that remember 2020, and maybe some of our listeners weren't Bengals fans then or paying attention as closely as they are now, but yeah, I think a lot of people were nervous, scared. It was the biggest fear. It was one of the biggest talking points was, man, he's just taking a lot of hits. And he took one too many in the wrong spot at the wrong time when he was planted. And that's what happens to quarterbacks. So is he dealing with the normal aches and pains that quarterbacks deal with? Absolutely. But he has had a freak injury that I think now people look at and say, all right, well, he's injury prone. I don't think it's that yet. It could end up being there. We could a year from now or 2 years from now go that route. But I would say no as of now. That's my answer. It could evolve. It could change. But I think the answer is no.
The history for Joe Burrow says that he will be injured at some point in 2024. History doesn't always predict the future, of course. But in 2020, when he was still an LSU Tiger in the national championship game, he suffered torn rib cartilage, played through it, finished the game. In 2020, playing for the Bengals, he obviously had the catastrophic knee injury that I don't think you can really attribute to any injury proneness. There were two 300-pound men that fell into his knee. Wrong place, wrong time. Unlucky occurrence. And he hasn't had any major further incidences with that knee that was reconstructed. Although when you start to have that in your injury history, that's where maybe the injury prone or fragile label starts, because when you have that injury, when you're that early in your career, that fear of that injury occurring again in a way that is harder to come back from will always exist for the rest of Joe Burrow's career. Whenever we see a player around his feet, around his knee, coming into his shin, low off the edge, whatever it is, it can be a scary moment. And he has had further knee injuries. He twisted his knee in the January 2nd game against the Kansas City Chiefs in 2022, and then had an MCL sprain at the end of the Super Bowl in February, a couple weeks later. So it's not like he hasn't had other knee injuries. He's also dealt with hand injuries. Go back to Ohio State. He had the broken wrist that led to his eventual transfer when he didn't get to win the starting job. He had the pinky dislocation in December 2021, a month before that knee twist against the Kansas City Chiefs before the Super Bowl run. He was able to play through these things. And that is something that you credit Joe Burrow for. He is tough, and his teammates have talked about his toughness and ability to play through injury, and honestly play through a lot of injury at a pretty high level when it hasn't been a major injury until that calf strain last year, where it really hampered his ability to play. And then this wrist ligament tear, which, as you mentioned, James, is a pretty unprecedented scenario for a quarterback. And it's hard to know how avoidable that is. It's hard to know whether that's related to previous wear and tear on the wrist. It's hard to know how worried you should be about that going forward. It's one of those injuries where if it does recur, that is a nightmare scenario. And so that is scary, but does that mean he's injury prone? Or does that just mean that he has a couple of things in his history where you'd really like to see him avoid seeing any further damage to a couple of spots where he has had major injury, predominantly this wrist. But when you look at the history, it's mostly contact related stuff. So maybe he just needs to avoid some hits, right? Maybe that's part of the injury prone label, but it's not like a history of soft tissue tears. It's not like a history of concussions that you're worried about with Joe Burrow, where it's easier to get concussed after, the accumulation of concussions is something that you worry about for Tua Tagovailoa in Miami, or the hamstring of T. Higgins is a constant concern for the Cincinnati Bengals and for T. Higgins. There's not a whole lot of that in Joe Burrow's history. So in that respect, I don't necessarily know that there should be an injury prone label applied, but there is a long history of injuries here that you can dissect. And I can see where some of that conclusion comes from to some degree.
I think a lot of the ones you read weren't injuries. I think it's like the rib thing. He got hurt and he played through it. The pinky, same thing. Like there's a different level like that. Those fall under the aches and pains. Now the MCL element, that one is interesting. He missed that week 18 game, that 17th game. They had already won the AFC North. There was no reason for him to play after they beat the Chiefs to win the division in 21 and then re-aggravated it in the Super Bowl. So that one for sure. I mean, I remember him limping off the podium after the game in Super Bowl 56. But some of those things are just, you're right. It's the hits. It's why we're so excited to see a Trent Brown and Orlando Brown Jr., and why everyone was excited when Alex Kappa, Ted Karras, and once upon a time, Lyle Collins got to town. Why Amarius Mims, to me, was a no-brainer at pick 18. Because you want him to take less hits. I think he's as good about taking care of his body as you can be, and willing to evolve and change the way he's doing things or tweak the way he does things to stay on the field. But man, the hit factor, and it just to tie it into what we've seen during the offseason program, I think it's why people are excited about the idea of a little more play action, a little more under center, things that can hopefully make life easier on the offensive line and maybe easier on Joe Burrow. So he doesn't always have to stand in there while he's reading the defense and empty or in shotgun and take some of those hits. Even if you can eliminate 8% of those hits or 10% of those hits, it could go a long way. Maybe not with these big injuries, right? The knee or the wrist, but these little things that have ailed him. Remember the throat issue where he had to go to the hospital after a game and he wasn't really talking? Like stuff like that, where it's like, man, hopefully it doesn't have to be this hard always, because he's just taken a ton of hits, and some of that's on him. Sure. Some of that's the offense. Some of that's on the offensive line. So hopefully they can maximize him and limit his number of hits this season.
Yeah, and that's why I credited him for the minor injuries on this list. He played through them, and he played well through them. And it's not like he has that laundry list of things that you look at and you're like, man, that's a repeatable injury. Hopefully we don't have to deal with that again. Yeah. And I think that is an argument in favor of saying maybe injury prone isn't quite the right label, but certainly some injury history to be worried about for Joe Burrow. Let's wrap up the conversation on injury proneness and get to a lighter topic. Who will
Yeah,
replace
babe.
Tyler Boyd as Joe Burrow's locker neighbor? Coming up next.
Oh. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle, to level it up to peak performance. And my Daewoo is performing very, very nicely, whether it's a supercharger, roof rack, exhaust kit, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. They have over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. So you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.
The bow I would like to put on the injury-prone discussion, I mentioned Tua Tagovailoa as a quarterback who's dealt with concussions over time. Wanted to also just bring up Patrick Mahomes' injury history and just talk about it in a vacuum. Maybe I shouldn't have said who it was, but Mahomes had a concussion and started to deal with turf toe in the same game in the playoffs in 2021 against the Cleveland Browns. In 2022, the turf toe injury came back. So Mahomes has a little bit of a history of turf toe. He had the high ankle sprain, of course, in 2023 that he played through. None of these individually would make you think injury prone, but when you talk about recurring injuries that you worry about for players, turf toe is definitely one of them that you see when it happens for a player once. It often happens for that player on a recurring basis, and concussions are an issue that you never want to see recur. And Mahomes did have a concussion back in college in 20, must have been 20. It's listed here as 2014. That feels like too long ago.
No, I
Is
mean, he was
Mahomes that
drafted in
old?
2017. So yeah,
I guess that could check out. He also did have a wrist fracture. That was not his throwing hand, but a similarity there. But regardless, 2 concussions in Mahomes' history, along with turf toe. Nobody talks about Patrick Mahomes as injury prone. He manages to play through a lot of his injuries. He does all that work to stay on the field, and they get, whatever they're doing behind the scenes in Kansas City to get him to play through that high ankle sprain at a high level. No one's calling Patrick Mahomes injury prone, but perhaps that's just because he hasn't had the major injury, and some of that is luck, as we discussed with Joe Burrow. And
Yeah.
so the luck element that happens for players over time that gets lumped into these labels, I think is probably somewhat overblown. And that's why I wanted to bring up the comparison.
Yeah, I think it makes sense because the difference between the two is the major injuries. And so what I led off with, all right, well, Burrow could get that label fairly if he has another injury or two, and it could change in the future. All right, well, just avoid these major injuries moving forward. You're going to get nicked up. It's the other element. These guys are going to get nicked up. They're playmakers. These defensive players know how great they are. They're the 2 best quarterbacks on the planet, I think, in most people's minds when they're healthy. And so, yeah, those things are going to happen, the little things. Let's just avoid the major ones. And the good news is, if a minor thing comes up here or there, you have a guy in Jake Browning that you have confidence in. And this is probably the first time during the Burrow era where you have a pretty good idea of what the backup would bring if you were out or if he were out for a game or two. So that is a good feeling, I would say, that the ship would stay afloat if they did lose Burrow for a game or two.
Yeah, ideally. We'll see. Hopefully we don't have to see. We'll see how Jake Browning performs in training camp this year, in the preseason this year. Quarterback development, quarterback performance is not linear. Sometimes you do have those flashes in the pan, but the Bengals are confident in Jake Browning, of course, and have a very cost-controlled asset at backup quarterback in a position where if you want to be good at backup quarterback, you do end up having to pay some money. So that is a big benefit for the Bengals. The last thing I'll say on Burrow and the injury-prone label is let's avoid stuff like the calf strain. If stuff like that calf strain or soft tissue injuries recur that really hamper his ability to play, that would put me more in the injury prone category for Joe Burrow than another major injury, because a lot of those major injuries, like I said, are just freak plays where they're one-off incidences that are very unlucky, whereas recurring soft tissue stuff that really hampers you, that gives me more concern for the long-term injury prone label.
Sure. And yeah, that's the one where he really couldn't be effective through it. And they made it work. And
Sort of.
yeah, right. But he re-aggravated it week 2 of
Mhm.
Baltimore. And that's what really screwed it up. Different place in the calf. Anyways, hopefully we never have to talk about the calf again. And we can talk about fun topics like, well, I guess it's fun. It's fun to figure out who not will replace Tyler Boyd as Joe Burrow's locker mate, but who's going to slide in. And it was part of our mailbag, I think. I don't know if you have the question up.
It was Jesse Kephart at Kephart14 with Tyler Boyd gone. Who's going to be Joe Burrow's new locker neighbor was the question earlier this week.
I think a lot of people would instantly default, Jake, to Jamar Chase. I don't think Jamar's moving. I don't. It's T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are right next to each other. Last I checked, there was a locker between them that was empty, so you get that extra space in there. Now, the locker room isn't the locker room right now. It's being completely redone. So if there was ever a time where Burrow and Chase were going to be right next to each other, it would be now. But I think back to 2020 and Burrow gets drafted in less than a week later, the Bengals release Andy Dalton. Well, Burrow just took Andy Dalton's locker. And so usually that's how it happens. AJ Green has T. Higgins has AJ Green's locker. During COVID, I'm not sure where he was, by the way, that 2020 season where they were teammates, but he has AJ Green's old locker now. So usually that's what happens. So my guess, if it's like the old setup, if they were in the old locker room, would be Jermaine Burton just slides in there where Tyler Boyd was and is right next to Joe Burrow. In this new setup where the locker room is going to look completely different, I have no idea what to expect, to be honest with you. Maybe this is where Jamar moves over and it's the Burrow Chase show. At the same time, maybe they want a little distance. They know each other pretty well. So it's not like they need to be locker mates.
I have a question because it's been a while since I've seen the locker room. And when I did see the locker room, I was just walking through. Do they tend to do offense, defense pretty separated on like opposite sides of the locker room?
Yeah, there's definitely sections, right? Where like the offensive linemen are in a section, the wide receivers, tight ends, running backs are all on one side of the wall. Yeah, for the most part, that's the case. When the roster's at 90, it isn't because it's at 90. And so you're just finding spots for rookies. But then once they settle into that 53-man roster, absolutely. So that's what happens. Yeah.
So if you go from one wide receiver to another, the first name you mentioned when we looked at this question, we didn't quite get to it in the mailbag, was Jermaine Burton sliding in and taking a former receiver's locker. Yep. My mind immediately went to Jamar Chase, of course, in the scenario you just discussed. But then I was thinking, well, if they're trying to organize it by position, and who knows what the new locker room layout looks like, or if it's significantly changed at all from a layout perspective, would it not just be Jake Browning or one of
he's right there. He's 2 over, so he's really close. Boyd was in between Browning and Burrow, so yeah, you could slide him.
And maybe you just expand Joe Burrow's space a little bit. I don't know. You just
give him a throne.
Yeah.
A Game of Thrones throne.
Yeah.
That says King of the North 2021, 2022.
Yeah.
And then you can just add years to it every year. That'd be funny.
Yeah. So you could put Browning beside him.
Yeah, you could.
And that would make a lot of sense. The other one I was thinking about would be like Drew Sample, or maybe somebody that he's much closer to on the team, like Sam Hubbard. The guys
they're close. So like when you walk into the locker room on one side, again, old layout, but Burrow's locker's there, and then he could throw. Well, obviously he could throw, but like he's within 10 feet of Sam Hubbard and Trey Hendrickson because they're on that back wall. So he could kind of see him out of the corner of his eye almost. So they're pretty close.
And that's why I asked a question about like the positional organization, because I wasn't sure how the Bengals did that. Because if Burrow just wanted to be by the guys he's tight with, it would be Sam Hubbard and like, I don't know, Jake Browning, maybe a tight end. maybe Jamar would be the ones that would come to mind, right? If Burrow has some sort of say in it, or maybe they just
Sure.
do position groups.
Yeah, and maybe they will. That's what's interesting is will they? How will it look? Will the design be different? Will Burrow be in the back of the locker room versus the front of the locker room? I don't know. Is it more convenient because all the facilities, all of the things, lifting and everything is in the back of the locker room, all the new hydrotherapy, all that stuff. So would you want to be back there because you're closer to that stuff? I don't know. So I think he'll get his pick. He is the franchise, but it'll be interesting. There we go. A little locker room talk.
Yeah, we'll have to revisit this one. We'll have to remember this one, earmark it to come back to it when that locker room eventually opens at some point in the future. To finish up the show, there is going to be a difference in the Bengals practices next week. We will break down what changes when the Bengals enter the OTA phase of the offseason to finish up the show coming up next.
Wouldn't it be great if you could see all of your investment and retirement accounts in one place? With Yahoo Finance, you can consolidate your views from multiple accounts into one hub and access the expert analysis you need to tend to your entire portfolio with confidence. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're looking for extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need in one place. They are the number one finance destination, producing a holistic look at the financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors, and Yahoo Finance ensures you have the right insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. With a community of over 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com.
James, we've discussed the Bengals practices each week here as they've been working through the various off-season phases where you're allowed different amounts of time in each practice. You're allowed certain maximums of on-field time. It started at 90 minutes max on the field each day, and players can choose what 2 out of 4 hours each day they're at the facility for a maximum of 4 hours per day in phase one. In phase two, you're allowed to get all coaches on the field. You're allowed some additional drills, but you're still not allowed offense versus defense. In phase three, which is what we're entering for the Cincinnati Bengals, and the Bengals will get to do some of their OTAs, organized training activities. The Bengals get 3 weeks for 10 total OTA practices, a maximum of 3 OTAs each week in the first 2 weeks. And the big difference here is you're allowed 7-on-7, 9-on-7, and even 11-on-11 if you're so inclined, but no live contact. But you're allowed some offense versus defense work, and you're allowed to have players wear helmets and wear shells. They're not wearing full pads, but elbow pads, knee pads are permitted. All of this in addition to 1 week of mandatory minicamp allowed in phase three. But the big difference is 2 more hours a day, offense versus defense allowed, which is significant. Jermaine Burton just talked about that. And some pads allowed in phase three of the offseason program.
You like what you're showing as a deep threat, Jermaine? I haven't gone up against defense yet, so no. It's the best answer ever. I love it because it's real, right? I mean, what is he showing as a deep? Jake Lisco could get out there and run. Doesn't mean he's a deep threat, right? Until the defense is there. But I am excited to see it. It will be good to see the next phase. I was asked a question about the helmets too, which obviously there are teams already that have started this process and the schedules are just different. So the Bengals will get there really shortly this coming week. So I'm curious to see when we see Jamar, right? We're not going to see T anytime soon. Will we see Jamar for this week? I think we could, and that would be good. But he did tell Olivia Ray of WLWT that he had a throwing session with Joe Burrow. So one of Joe's first throwing sessions in Cali. So that's good to see. Regardless, though, the OTAs, we'll see a little bit more. It's still not a ton, but to your point, it's a little bit more. And it'll be good for these rookies because man, I was looking at it yesterday, Jake. They are banking on a lot of these rookies to contribute right away. And that includes Amarius Mims, by the way.
Yeah, it'll just be good to see some offense versus defense drills. See Joe Burrow's ball placement when there are defensive players trying to get in the way of the passes and you're not just throwing on air. See what these receivers, Jermaine Burton, Charlie Jones, Andre Yosevich in particular, are doing in terms of getting open against defensive players. And, for 7-on-7s, you hear coaches, quarterbacks talk about this all the time. The ball should never hit the ground in 7-on-7s. That is something that skews heavily in the offense's favor. But if the Bengals do use the opportunity to at some point do some 11-on-11 work, not that, again, there's live contact or anything like that. It is a scaled down version of what you get in training camp. No matter what you're doing, just seeing offense, defense stuff and getting a feel for how some of these guys are performing and executing on some stuff that we've been seeing happen on air, and actually getting a look at some defensive players doing something that is more than just conditioning or position drills, seeing them actually have some competition to play against. Those are all things that are exciting parts of that transition in the offseason. And while it is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively minor, maybe you're listening to this show and you're saying, man, we're really scraping for content in May. That is, I think, an actual point of significance when you enter the OTA program or the OTA part of the offseason program, because getting just offense versus defense competition is so different from positional drills and playing against air.
Well, Josh Newton gets to guard Jamar potentially. Like, think about that, how valuable that is. Like Dax Hill gets to guard Jamar, and he's guarded him one-on-one before in drills, but valuable reps, to your point, and valuable reps for Miles Murphy, valuable reps for DJ Turner as he tries to take a step forward. Cam Taylor-Britt wants to take another step forward. By the way, did we talk about him graduating? Either way, congratulations to Cam graduating. We didn't, did we?
I can't remember. It was on a list of things that we were going to talk about. I don't know if we got to it or not.
Yeah. Anyways, congrats, Cam, Mr. Graduate. I told him in person, but if you missed it, he graduated over the weekend. So that's really cool too. But a lot of guys that they're hoping take a step forward. And also, to your point, having Joe throw with defenders in the area. And I'm sure he's done it, right? I'm sure he's done it on his own time, but it will be good to see for sure.
The linebacker, running back matchups, the tight ends going against some defenders.
Gesicki.
Where do they put Dax Hill on Mike Gesicki? Do we get some early clues as to some sub packages for Dax Hill that I'm still scraping for and thinking that he's more than just competing for the boundary corner job, but also seeing him competing for the boundary corner job going against live competition for the first time is a noteworthy. I mean, you started with Josh Newton, but when you mentioned Dax Hill, it's like, oh yeah, Dax Hill against receivers. That is a big one that we start to see starting next week.
Charlie Jones, Andre Yosevich. Will these guys take a step forward?
Yeah, mention that one.
No, I'm just saying, like, the things that non-rookies, obviously all the rookies stand out. It'll be big for Chris Jenkins. It'll be big for McKinley Jackson, those two dudes. It'll be big for Amarius Mims because he's going to be the biggest guy on the field. Did you see where he's going to be playing at 350?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah, they wanted him to add weight. Imagine telling a 340-pound man, yeah, we need you to add 10. You're a little light.
I don't think it's any problem. He is huge.
Yeah.
Light on his feet, too.
Yeah. The clips of Amarius Mims moving are exactly what you'd expect. The guy can move at a high level. That's what you expected when the Bengals drafted him. We'll continue to see practices ramp up a little bit starting next week. And of course, we'll have you covered after Tuesday's practices here on Locked On Bengals and more. We're not taking any days off here in the month of May as the Bengals finish up their offseason program. So we'll have you covered. And one series we're working on for the future, just to start teasing this now, is an idea that we're honestly stealing from Locked On Bills, Joe Marino. Shout out, Joe, I know you're listening to Locked On Bengals for some reason today. The most important players for the future of the Cincinnati Bengals, not just this year, but going into the future as well, a series that we are going to be working on in the future that I'm pretty excited for. And that's why I'm telling you about it like 2 weeks early, probably. Until next time, that's going to do it for
is number one on my list. Spoiler.
Okay. Hot take, starting things off for James Rapine. Until next time, That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.